Muy bien, perfecto. Muchas gracias a todos por participar.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. I will have my screen. My name is Eduardo José Sanchez. I'm coordinating the Let's Lag platform. It's a pleasure to be sharing this space with you. What we have today is carbon dioxide removal. Why analyze its governance now? This is a subject that all of us working in climate change, we're all very interested in. It's not an easy subject. There has been a lot of discussion. And today, the topics dealt with here is not something that is common within the climate change community or with great frequency. However, this topic is extremely important. And before beginning, I would like to thank C2G, Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. C2G is working with us and sponsoring this meeting. It's very important for us to have their participation, and also to ETLAC and Euroclimate, who have been working with us in this webinar. Let's Lag is a platform seeking to promote the climate change platform. I say what it seeks is to connect different points in the world, and you're all welcome. So before beginning, I have 3 minutes for this presentation. It's important that we understand, what do we mean? What do we mean when we say governance? And I will read a few chapters of a report 1.5 of IPCC and what is understood according to that report on governance. Or that say that with the use of carbon dioxide removal, 100 to 1,000 gigatons would be eliminated. The application of CR, if you hear this term before, water, if they are applied worldwide, reforestation and bioenergy can compete with other uses of earth and have agricultural impacts. Biodiversity, if there is no effective governance to guarantee the permanence of removed CO2, what is governance? Governance is a broad concept, very inclusive in order to manage, implement, and supervise policies and measures. While the most inclusive concept is to recognize contributions of different levels of government, global, regional, and local, national, local, and the roles of contribution of private sector, civil society to lead to the different issues. Climate governance is the set of mechanisms and measures designed to exercise social systems for prevention and adaptation of risks involved in climate change. If we understand this as a basis, then we begin our webinar. So we will move on to the rules. First, you can see on your screen that there is a chat and a Q&A. Please, all of your questions for panelists, please send them in the Q&A. We also have simultaneous interpretation. There is an icon saying interpretation, and you can find the channels in English and Spanish. This is being recorded, and presentations are available in the Let's Lag webpage. It is a true pleasure for me to welcome Thelma Krug and Natalia Rubiano. Thelma is Vice President of IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and her presentation is on the role of carbon dioxide removal. And Natalia Rubiano, with whom we began in this project more than a year ago in C2G, will make a presentation on carbon dioxide removal approaches and governance considerations. She is from Lund University, and it's a great honor to share this panel with two brilliant speakers. I welcome you both. Thelma, the floor is yours.
Buenos días a todos, es un placer estar acá.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the invitation of the organizers to participate in this event as Vice President of the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change. I will refer to some issues on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius that has been approved in October 2018 because it provides elements that are very relevant for this issue. The removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and the role of governance. Eduardo referred to some of the outcomes of IPCC, and hopefully I will add a few other elements. This special report of IPCC was prepared as a response to an invitation of climate attention to approach the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, as well as the pathways of the emissions of greenhouse gases in order to limit warming at this level at the end of this century. So the report was prepared within the context of strengthening the global response to the threat of climate change, sustainable development, and eradication of poverty. Next slide, please, Alia. When estimating that human activity have caused a global warming of approximately 1 degree Celsius, the report of the IPCC indicates that it is unlikely that only past emissions and present emissions already compromise the planet to a 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there is a window of opportunity to limit warming at this level, but this will call for unprecedented efforts at all levels of society. This will globally need a greater scale and speed of change in order to transform energy systems, including their transportation, constructions, industrial systems, infrastructure, urban, and the use of land use. The models that have been evaluated in this report, the anthropogenic emissions of CO2 decrease approximately 45% in 2030 as compared to 2010, reaching net zero around 2050 with simultaneous reductions of other non-CO2 emissions, for example, methane. On this slide, I show different pathways of CO2 emissions that limit global warming to 1.5 until 2100. Some of these pathways are called overshoot pathways. They exceed the warming of 1.5 before the end of the century, and that is why they need to be reduced to 1.5. Then, on the gray area that you can see on this slide, you can see the net global anthropogenic CO2 emissions in the pathways with overshoot. In blue, you have the pathway as higher overshoots. The other ones were limited. And in all of the pathways of no or limited overshoot, as well as those pathways with a higher overshoot, the CO2 emissions are reduced to zero net or net zero at worldwide level, and that is in 2050. Zero net or net zero will be the removal. On the figure, you can see 4 illustrative pathways of emission, P1, P2, P3, and P4. We will provide some details on these pathways or guides in the next slide. P1, P2, 3, and 4. Here we have the 1.5 illustrative pathways. Let us focus on the P1 pathway that represents a pathway with no or limited overshoot. And P4 is the one that has an overshoot above 1.5 at some point until the end of the century. These pathways are the result from different mitigation strategies in order to achieve the net emission reductions that would be needed to follow a pathway that will limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. All the routes use the CO2 removal, which is the topic of this seminar. But the amount will vary depending on the pathways. Likewise, the relative contributions of bioenergy with capture and storage of carbon and the extraction in agriculture, forestry, and other areas. The IPCC report used BECCS, which is bioenergy with capture and storage of carbon, and also reforestation and forestation that have 2 colors here on this slide. The yellow is BECCS, the bioenergy, and the other color would be for reforestation. P1 scenario, which is the first one to the left, is one of low demand of energy for 2050 and with an energy system that allows for rapid decarbonization of energy supply. In order to achieve the net reductions of emissions that are necessary, reforestation in P1 is the only option that is considered. That's why you don't see any yellow. You see the use of reforestation, which is indicated in the darker color, brownish. On the other side, on the right side, in the P4 pathway, there is a scenario of where you have a much higher demand of fuel for transportation and animal products, and where emission reductions is conducted through a strong use of capture, or rather elimination, removal of CO2. That in this case is through the implementation of bioenergy with capture and storage of carbon. That's BECCS, and that is the yellow you can see on P4. So if you compare P1 and P4, there is a difference. These are different scenarios that will require different mitigation portfolios and different methods as well for the elimination of CO2 of the atmosphere. In the next one, you can see that in addition to forestry and BECCS, there are other elements and technologies for CDR from the atmosphere, not only back and reforestation. The importance of the removal of CO2 is both to compensate for residual emissions of CO2 or carbon dioxide, as well as to achieve the negative emissions that are necessary for the overshoot routes or pathways in order to limit global warming to 1.5 at the end of the century. When we speak about residual emissions, that means that when we look and see 2050 that the emissions of carbon dioxide will be net zero, there are situations where this will not be possible. So these methods can also be used for the compensation or offsetting of these residual emissions.
This also includes ocean fertilization, the capture of CO2 in the air, and storage. And Natalia, in the next presentation, will be presenting this in a very detailed way. The next slide. Here we also show the first column, which shows some methods for the removal of CO2, which are based on the ground, and it includes carbon sequestration in the ground, and also the weathering, which is looking for, I didn't find the word in Spanish, but it's also a biochar. And if you see here, it's also very interesting because it shows the annual potential of CO2 removal, the cost per ton of eliminated CO2, and also the need for water. And very important are issues related to the permanence and saturation, more specifically a problem for the afforestation and reforestation activities, and also for the issue of sequestration by the soils. So this is a very interesting slide. The next. So some of these methods that we call methods of CO2 removal are also considered as part of the options based on nature, which are centered on the protection, restoration, and sustainable management of the ecosystems of the world. For example, reforestation. Apart from eliminating CO2, from removing CO2 from the atmosphere, can also be a way of adaptation to climate change, protecting against floods, against storms, and depending on the type of reforestation, it can also improve biodiversity. So this issue of afforestation and reforestation is a very specific topic because depending on the species, on what you're planting, may have deleterious effect as well. And IPCC is very strong in saying that the implementation of these methods in large scale has not totally evaluated its risks. We're talking about large-scale reforestation, bioenergy in large scale. So all this can present problems, such as negative effects, as of lack of food security, amongst others, among several other effects. The next. IPCC says that if there are large negative impact. These methods of CO2 removal adverse for the social and environmental objectives that largely depends on the governance of the use of soil. That's why I showed you a separate slide of ocean fertilization and the methods related to the earth. And there's a definition of IPCC in the 1.5 report SR for governance, because that's a topic that's very clear in what it means to say. It says that it is a comprehensive and all-inclusive concept of the full range of means to decide, manage, implement, and monitor policies and measures. So an important part of this definition is that it also recognizes the contributions of different levels of governments. Here we're saying global, international, regional, subnational, and local contributions, and also the contribution from the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and civil society. And we also talk very much about local communities, indigenous peoples. So we're talking of governance that we'll explain later, but this is a very fundamental point. It is how to involve in the decision-making process as well as implementation and monitoring all these stakeholders. The next slide highlights some of those elements of effective governance, where we see that the first element is multi-level governance, which is more all-encompassing than what I mentioned there or what appears in the definition of IPCC. So here, these are elements of an effective governance, starting there with a multi-level governance. There I highlight and bold type, enhanced climate education, a greater public awareness, arrangements to permit a fast change in behavior, monitoring systems. All these are elements of governance. But when we're talking about effective governance, we're talking about many elements that come together. IPCC, I think it's the next slide, recognizes that the existing governance mechanisms are scant, they're few. And also, when we talk about international governance, such as the case of ocean fertilization, and also what does not appear under CO2 removal, but what was called the modification of solar radiation. They require global governance, because an implementation on one place can have effects on a different site. So for the part of ocean fertilization, there is a mechanism of international governance under the Convention of Biological Biodiversity, and there you have the link if you are interested. So in this decision, they recognize the fact that there are not sufficient reliable data covering all the aspects of ocean fertilization, without which there is no adequate baseline to evaluate potential risks of fertilization. And there it says that considering this scientific and legal analysis that's ongoing, it requests the countries, the governments, with a precautionary approach to guarantee that the ocean fertilization activities do not take place until we have an adequate scientific basis to justify said activities. So, an example of international governance that is necessary, or a topic where we see that there are potential risks. As a last message here, I believe it's an interesting message, is that collective efforts at all levels, in such a way as to reflect different circumstances and capacities and the objective of limiting global warming to 1.5 and considering equity and effectiveness may facilitate the strengthening of the global response to climate change, achieve sustainable development, and eradicate poverty. This was one of the messages in the summary presented by the IPCC to the country, showing that it is possible for us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but this will require collective effort at every level. So with this, I believe that I conclude my presentation. I don't know whether I went beyond my 15 minutes. Alia, please. Thank you very much, Delma. Thank you, Eduardo. I'm sorry if I went beyond my time. Don't worry, the presentation was very interesting. Natalia, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. And Thelma, thank you so much. And remember that the questions will be made after the end of Natalia's presentation. But once again, Thelma, thank you so much. What you said was very interesting. Natalia, you are welcome. Thank you, Thelma. Thank you, Eduardo. I'm sharing my screen. As it was said, I'm Natalia Rubiana. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Lund. I'm looking at the political economy of the negative emissions technologies, and here I am sharing with you today. Maybe some of you are familiar with this graph. It comes from the emissions gap report from UNEP last year, and it shows us that it shows us where we're heading with scenarios conditional and non-conditional. We are going beyond, we are overshooting the 2-degree level. I believe that we're around 3.5 degrees, and that is complying with the NDCs at a global level. As Thelma was showing, there is a large gap to be able to comply not just with the 2 degrees, but even with the 1.5 degrees, and all the scenarios of IPCC levels require negative emissions technologies in order to achieve that. These technical technology and techniques are quite diverse. There's a growing portfolio, as Thelma already explained here. I'm presenting this graph. I believe it's quite visual and gives us an idea of the main ones. For example, ocean fertilization, which basically is putting nutrients into the ocean in order to promote the growth of phytoplankton and algae that would capture CO2 and sink it to the bottom of the ocean. The enhancement of the meteorization of the rocks and ocean alkalinization, which is basically to use alkaline minerals to absorb CO2, capture it, and to sink it to the bottom of the ocean. As Thelma had said, we must emphasize on the ocean topics which are quite controversial because there's much uncertainty insofar as the impacts that it might cause. They might be somewhat complicated. We have more natural ones such as afforestation and reforestation and restoration of ecosystems, carbon sequestration to the soil. which is basically burning biomass in order to produce this carbon that's distributed in the soil and gives nutrients and improves the quality of the soil. There's another type of technology such as bioenergy with capture and storage of carbon that measure or direct capture from the air, which are basically some plants, sort of buildings, giant buildings that through chemical process capture CO2 from the air and store it in underground sinks.
These technologies can be classified in several ways. I'm sharing the classification: natural technologies or nature-based solutions, which are basically the ones that need or are based on photosynthesis in order to capture this CO2. Combined technologies, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, combining the two existing technologies. And the more technological, like direct air capture or warming, ocean warming. All of fertilization, that is, ocean fertilization. They all have advantages and risks. As I've said, those in the first line have a lower cost, but have a risk of permanence and limits. You can't plant trees or generate soil carbon until reach a saturation point. There is an issue of permanence. It's very important if we consider tipping points or climate tipping points. We know that the jungles are quite vulnerable to climate impact. And at some point, if they exceed or go beyond, the balance disappears and they can become CO2 emitters instead of capturers. And all of these nature-based solutions will, or the impact thereof, depends on the type of solution. There's not one single formula that is applicable to all. For example, reforestation or restoration of ecosystems. Ecosystem restoration can be very beneficial for the environment, for local communities, but it can be slow and will not generate negative emissions. As afforestation or reforestation that can create food security, or conflicts of land, alteration of ecosystems, depending on how it is implemented. Why is it important to think about governance or about these nature-based solutions? As you well know, these solutions, afforestation, reforestation, are not new solutions. There is experience from way back. And it's important to think, who is going to implement this? How is the land going to be used? What are the costs involved? We know because of the experience on mitigation. I mean, financial resources are limited. The monitoring and reporting and verification of these solutions is quite complicated. It's important to avoid negative incentives. For example, to have native or grasslands or native forests become income generators. And so you need to seek a balance between the climate objectives, sustainability, and permanence. What to do if a carbon that was captured in a forest for 10 years all of a sudden catches fire and they go back to the atmosphere? How do you manage that? Who is responsible? What do we do in those cases? And of course, there is some space for governance of these initiatives. You know well, UNFCCC or CCC, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Accord, FAO, Biological Diversity Agreement, the governance at local and national levels. And something with which there is experience is current and past mitigation initiatives, for example, RED Plus, or counting emissions that can generate lessons that can be applied to negative emission technologies, and how to respond to dynamic situations or technological situations generated by these types of projects. Well, now moving on to technological solutions. There is a mixed solution, which is the bioenergy with capture and storage of carbon. The advantage of this is that it can be permanent, can absorb the carbon for a long time, but it also has risks and difficulties, have a high cost, generation involves a high cost. They are in a very early stage, and still they are not available at the scale that is needed. None of these technologies exist at the level, at the scale, at the time needed, needed for implementation and thus achieve the objectives of each country. Bioenergy with capture and storage of carbon prevails in the IPCC models with reforestation and other technologies of negative emissions based on soil. These techniques, or there are small scale demonstrations still. It's not ready. There are certain considerations as to the use of soil, water, and transportation and storage, transportation of biomass, and transportation and storage of CO2. Direct capture from air, these is a promising technology, but still has a very high cost. It's not ready to be scaled, has no scalability, and it has to access low carbon energy. Otherwise, the process could be very cumbersome. And the issue of enhanced weathering, we haven't found the exact translation. It is like erosion, spray, improved meteorization, alkalinization of oceans. It is technically possible, but not proven at any scale. Now, the distribution of alkaline ores would need to be extracted from mining processes. Therefore, for that, you need infrastructure for extraction and transportation. And all that could have impacts or side risks or impacts that need to be considered. At large scale, the risks are not known, and there could be potential risks for health with this sort of dust that would be generated and disseminated. Now, why to think about governance on technological solutions that do not exist yet? Well, precisely. An important step is governance of research in oceans. Reiterating, yes, there are certain guidelines of CBD, the Protocol Convention of London. But anyhow, we need policies in order to promote research and development, incentives, and sustainability of these kinds of initiatives. We need to look for financial incentives in the same way, report accountability and verification mechanisms. And something that is key is technological transfer. Many of these technologies have been experimented, tried, or proven in countries of the North. And once again, the question, who would do it? Who is responsible? Who would benefit? How is it implemented? And then here, I would like to raise a few questions. These are open questions. Why do we need to think about governance? We have no answer to these questions yet. So it's important to start thinking about these issues. And one is who should govern govern this CDR from research development until implementation and verification? What objectives could be met by different methods of CDR? Temperature objectives, synergies with other development objectives, offsetting. There are some difficult objectives. Storage and use. Do we govern only for permanent storage or for the use of CO2 for industrial forms or industrial methods? How can we design public policy instruments that will contribute to achieve these objectives? Are the existing institutions appropriate, or should we create new ones? Global governance is important, and as you know, this process takes a long time. So we cannot create an institution that will govern and regulate negative emissions from overnight. No. It's a long process, and time, we have very little time. There's not one single solution. It's not A, B, or C. It's not only nature-based solution. It's not only technology. We need a portfolio of different initiatives in order to achieve the Paris objectives. And mitigation will continue to be one key main priority. And the higher or the more aggressive mitigation or decarbonization is, we will think even less in the portfolio or the level of energy mitigation that we would need to use. And then finally, the portfolio of these technologies should be designed contemplating different factors: efficiency, how efficient these technologies, what are the co-benefits, how scalable is it, what are the potential risks? Ideally, promoting democratic processes, taking into account initiatives, and of course, not only economic considerations, but also social and ecological considerations. And that's all. Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia, for your presentation. We have less than 15 minutes to answer questions. Thelma, is it possible for you to turn on your video in order to answer the questions? I will read them all. Many of them can be grouped in 2 topics or 3 topics, main ones. One is forestry, oceans, and 3, structure, social structure, political structure issues that convene us. I will read all the questions, and then I would ask Thelma and Natalia to please let us group all the questions so as to provide a macro response. And if any of the panel members has any additional question, we will include it. The first one from Maria Mansour. CO2 sequestration technologies are developed and they are possible for countries and for sensitive economies like Latin America, ecology and reforestation. Then what to do for countries to comply with the nationally determined commitments? And that has to do with the presentation of Thelma. Jenny is asking, in capture of CO2 in water environments, can you increase ocean acidification? Also as to oceans, what do you mean with ocean fertilization? Moises would like to know the differences between CCS, bioengineering, and EDC. And deforestation and afforestation and urban is technically valid for ADS, and where can you obtain methods based on nature, how to achieve reductions in Latin America after the pandemic, considering that restoration of economy, like in Ecuador, is based on extractive industries. Is it possible to define anthropogenic conditions? There are different ways to define it. How can we approach governance with non-empowered citizens' levels of intervention and the precarious participation in Latin America? What is the role of cities that are the largest emitters? What would happen if governments of different countries do not adopt mitigation or adaptation measures until 2030? As I've said, there are very, very many questions. Thelma, please, although these are very interesting questions, please let us be brief with the different answers.
You're muted. Thank you very much, Eduardo. I'm sorry, I couldn't really understand all the questions because you were very fast. Let's give it a try. I will first answer Edgar's question. He spoke about the difference of herring and nadia. In IPCC, we don't talk no more about that because the concept of herring, the idea, included before both the part of CO2 removal as well as the modification of solar radiation. They were the two that was called hail and herring. But the state of the art, the knowledge about the CO2 removal is more advanced than the modification of solar radiation. It was disaggregated, so now we talk about each of them in a separate way because they are different. One removes and the other one prevents the radiation from reaching the earth. So we don't not talk about that anymore. So this is one. The other one, of course, Maria, your question. And I believe this affects other questions as well. Latin America, in our potential and also our contribution, our nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, were very supportive in the use of land, the afforestation, reforestation, sustainable management of forest, recovery of the ecosystems. So there it is that we have a greater potential. IPCC, we also said that the greatest contribution that we can have is the elimination of deforestation or the reduction of emissions by deforestation as well as forest degradation. Then sustainable management that keeps the forests standing and also afforestation and reforestation. So the process of CO2 removal by afforestation, depending on the species that are planted, are not fast, particularly those of the native species. It takes much time to recover. So we're doing an exercise to see how much reforestation is needed in order to compensate emissions by deforestation. And we said that it's not a good exchange, a good swap, I would say. But it is still an important way. But the amount of reforestation needed to reach a CO2 zero around 2050 is huge. So we really do not know the impact on the soil, the impact for populations as well, because they are expanding the forest and maybe affecting some of the local populations, as well as affecting indigenous peoples. So it is not simple. But as Natalia said in the network, we have high hopes that we may be able to have the funds to keep the forest with less deforestation. Eduardo, I'm going to stop here, then I'm going to give the floor to Natalia, and then I'll resume answering. Natalia. Thank you, Telma. Well, you commented the questions as to oceans. What's ocean fertilization? It is to insert nutrients such as iron to promote the growth of phytoplankton and algae. Things basically generating is photosynthesis and sinking of the ocean, so it would sink down, carrying carbon to the bottom of the ocean. The other type of ocean intervention is alkalinization of the oceans, to insert alkaline minerals to absorb CO2. This might counteract the pH level of ocean acidification. It could show benefits, but the levels, the quantities needed are hard to define. We don't have clear models about it, and I was saying, and as well as Thelma said, research at an ocean level is under the Convention for Biological Diversity and falls under the London Protocol and Convention. So it's very difficult to conduct any type of research, but it's hard for us to make any interventions or promote escalations in the ocean. These are proposals presented, but it's very hard to escalate them or to obtain real data at this moment. Thank you. I will try to summarize the following questions that fall into different topics because I believe they're very interesting. There's a topic that is very important here and questions have been asked. How should we have climate governance? Who will take upon itself the leadership role and how could these discussions pick up? There's also another question that I believe is quite relevant. It is the role of the carbon markets, climate governance, and the promotion of this type of technology. Also, additionally, while I review once again the other questions, in English and Spanish, we've been asked several times about organic emissions of the forests, the capture and the process of forests that also emit. How could there be an effective capture through forests? And finally, the role of the cities, which I also consider to be very relevant. Natalia. No. Natalia or me? Whoever. Who? Elma. Okay. If I may, Eduardo, I would like to go back to one question from the previous set of questions referring to cities. Cities are amazing. They can contribute enormously to the mitigation of climate change. They have very strong emissions. IPCC in 2020 to 2022 defined that they will have a special report on climate change and city. All the issue of building and transportation, which is considered to be one of the most complex for the cities. It is very difficult to reduce emissions and transportation, very hard. It requires very significant planning. There is a significant importance assigned to the cities, and we will approach it in the IPCC in the next cycle. The question is, who takes upon itself the role of governance? It is clear that the definition of IPCC imagines that the federal government has the role of governance, and from there search for the inclusion of all the remaining levels that we spoke of. But this is not very simple. As a definition, it's lovely. To include the NGOs, indigenous peoples. The complexity is fantastic, but it is possible. It is possible. But it is important because it requires tremendous time and energy because there we're talking about dialogues. We're talking of considering not only the most fundamental aspects, but also see how we're going to ensure eradication of poverty, sustainable development. There's an integration between the portfolio of mitigation as well as the SDGs. So it is very important for the governments to have that broader view. That it's not just for the climate, because there are negationists, and I will not go into detail on that, but there are negationists. So it can think thus that what actions can be adopted that will also include health, energy for everyone, access for everyone, more sustainable productions, the oceans as well. So there's much that the governments need to understand on part of a whole. And governance, the federal government can be like a stakeholder or the player that is capable of attracting broad discussions of all the aspects that I mentioned in my presentation. A comment here, there was a question of governance, of how to attain governance in Latin America with citizenship that is not very empowered or the like. Once again, in historic lessons, Latin America and the Caribbean have brought strong proposals as a whole and from civil society. Civil society can play a major role in these processes. So can indigenous peoples. Of course, it is hard to involve 100% of the population in this type of topic, but those directly affected or involved, it is important. Thus, the importance of this type of initiative of informing about the process that's just starting in terms of negative emissions. That's a conversation that's taking place often in some countries. In Europe, here in Sweden, there are some bioenergy and capture plants, but not that much in Latin America. So it is important to get this conversation started from the very start in order to somehow influence or support to go with it in a way. Can I add something else, Eduardo, for this topic? In 2005, the Climate Convention introduced in the agenda the issue of the Red Mars that Natalia has mentioned, which is basically a financial mechanism that pays for results of reduction of emissions by deforestation, forest degradation, conservation of the carbon stocks, sustainable management of forests, and for the increase of the carbon stock in the forest. So, in order to access the payments or reductions of the RED plus the activities that I mentioned are 5. So many requirements were established in the convention. Among them, an implementation plan that must also include the governance of these issues. And the safeguards in order to prevent several things, such as the conversion of native forests into plantations is one of them, or how to respect the indigenous peoples and the local communities. So the money, in a way, led to a very significant change in the developing countries in regards to their forests, in regards to the data or to a greater knowledge of what forces deforestation, and an implementation plan in order to reduce their emissions or to do conservation. So we also have this issue that money also helps. The effort of the countries to compensate actions in the developing countries, particularly who have so many more problems apart from the reduction of emissions, is an interesting aspect, and it's motivating, the red plus.
Velma, thank you very much. There is one topic that we would like to discuss. The question is very relevant, although the user is anonymous. As IPCC has a guideline for adaptation, a methodological one for mitigation, don't you think it's going to be necessary to have a guideline for governance? I will answer very fast. As IPCC is a panel of 195 governments. It's an intergovernmental panel. And everything we do, all the products we have, are the outcome requested by governments. And the idea that IPCC not to be political or prescriptive in the way government should do things. So you will not see something saying, look, this country is doing something that's not good, or this is not complying with. That exists in the literature, but it is the governments that stimulate all the products of IPCC, that is all the report, all the products, all the outcomes really. Not only do they tell us what they would like to do, but also but it's limited. Resources are limited. We wanted to do society change, but we didn't have the experts that could do all the work in 6-7 years with all the special reports we have on oceans, land, and warming of 1.5 degrees, also handbooks, inventories, refinement, and also assessment reports. 5,000 pages was the contribution of the 3 working groups of IPCC in 2014. 5,000 pages, that's a lot of scientific information. That's a lot of work. I will paraphrase a question of Robert Panduro, but it strikes me, sorry for not raising the exact question you have in the chat, but questions about research. Is it possible that IPCC or another organization to contribute in specific research for forests or technologies in Latin American countries? In group number 2, that deals with impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation, we have one part there that is regional. In South America is one of the regions of IPCC. So we do an assessment, an evaluation, an assessment of all the literature that is conducted in South America, in addition to the other Americas, of course. So we understand that there is plenty of literature on the region and the potential of the region. When we think, in many aspects, if we think, where are the major opportunities for the deforestation reduction in Latin America? Where is the greatest potential for reforestation? Latin America. Of course, we have a major opportunity for these things. And so I believe that IPCC already provides, in a more general manner, of course, for the region where the opportunities lie and the potential we have as a region to contribute to a mitigation of climate change, especially in agriculture, forests, or forestry, and the way how are we going to develop in terms of transportation, energy, industrial processes, and waste or residues. Waste. Yes, waste. Residuos. Waste. And that's it. Thelma, thank you very much. Natalia. In technology, there are several questions on where they can know more about technologies. Where do you find a database to search and would you recommend a database that attendants could access? Natalia, yes, of course. Go ahead. As to academic literature, there is quite a bit, but I would recommend the webpage of C2G. There is plenty of information that's been translated into Spanish. There are more complicated or more complex papers in English from academia. You can also resort to them, but as a gateway, I think that is a good introductory space, C2G webpage. And Thelma, yes, it's clear that IPCC conducts an assessment of all the literature existing in the world about different themes. Even about the removal of CO2. So they are there, but you will find them at greater depth in the report of 2021 next year. I don't know how what's going to be the lag or delay given the COVID. And there, where do we search information from? There you will have a source, a very rich source for the different topics that are dealt with there. Thank you very much. It's a true honor to share with you. Alejandra. Yes, thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Thelma, for attending. And while Alejandra shows the last slide we have for you to access the information, this material will be found in the Let's Lag webpage and in the taking into account the comments of the chat and Q&A, I think that the responsibility on climate governance is not one that falls only on governments. The definition I proposed at the beginning of IPCC is a broader definition involving several sectors with which we are working, and therefore the need to open up spaces like this one to start discussing, for example, having practice in community practices to discuss all these topics. Thanks to all the participants, especially for staying with us for these very interesting discussions. Hopefully you will be with us in future opportunities. Thank you very much and see you soon. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Yes, Natalia and Eduardo, everybody.